Welcome to At the Table with the Asian American Christian Collaborative. I'm so excited to be with all of you here today. At the Table is a series of roundtable discussions where Asian American Christian leaders, pastors, are able to draw from their experiences, their expertise, and their education to discuss things that are pertinent to the Asian American church and community and beyond. And so I'm really thrilled to be here with all of you. My name is Raymond Chang. I serve as the president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative. And I'm very excited to have this discussion on reaching and discipling the younger generations or the next generations. But before we get into that, I'd love for each of you to introduce yourselves. We'll start with you, Steve.
My name is Steve Chang. I'm the senior pastor of Living Hope Community Church in Orange County. I'm also a co-founder of Sola Network.
And then tell us a little about Sola so that people know.
Yeah, we exist to help Asian American pastors and churches to reach the emerging generation of Asian Americans with the gospel.
I'm Michele Turek. I serve as the National Coordinator for Asian Ministries at American Baptist Home Mission Society. So I work to support and resource all of our AAPI churches within ABC USA.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'm Jason Min. I serve as the lead pastor of a church in downtown Los Angeles called Citizens LA. And I've been in this role for about 5 years.
Thank you. Well, we're in a series called Flourish, and we want to see Asian Americans and the broader church just flourishing. So as we dive in, how would you define what flourishing is?
I saw the question beforehand, and I'm not sure if I'm going to give a downer answer, but I
Be
think
the downer.
As Christ followers, I'm not sure if we need to define flourishing as the world oftentimes defines flourishing. That it means to grow, it means to get more fame, it means to accomplish something that we want to accomplish per se. As Christ followers, I think we're more responsible to obey what Christ has called us to obey. So for some people, it may mean being a public leader when we are not wanting to be that public because we don't feel like we're gifted enough, or we don't feel like that's part of our culture. We don't, we don't feel like that God has prepared us for that. But if God calls us to that, we need to step out in faith and in boldness and in courage. I think of someone like Moses, right? For other people, it may mean that we don't go out and be that influential person, but be good and faithful to the corner that God has given to us. For some, it may mean to die to ourselves, to say in our prayer, if it be your will, God, I'd rather this cup pass from me. So as far as I'm concerned, flourishing for a Christian is whether we are good and faithful to that which Christ has called us to. That, I think, is ultimately what flourishing is.
And I hope all, regardless of what type of flourishing we're called to, are pursuing this death to self. So that's good.
I mean, you really stole the words right out of my mouth, Steve. I mean, I just feel like, for flourishing for those who follow Christ, it's to live fully into the person and to the life that God has called us to, right? So for us as Asian Americans, we were born as Asian Americans, and that is a part of our identity that we live into. So, and I'm sure we can continue talking about that in a little bit. But honestly, it really is not measured by, like what you said, it's not measured by the world's standards or expectations, or even the expectations of our parents or our friends or our community. It's centered on what the Lord would have for us, and I think that's true flourishing for us.
That's good.
I shared this in another talk, but for me, when I think about flourishing, I think about the restoration of our full humanity in and through Christ. And I think what I mean by that is, and to kind of piggyback off of what you said, Pastor Steve, I think the world has a definition for flourishing, especially the modern definition would be something like our individual freedom, happiness, self-expression, and a person who has those things, the world might look at that person and say they're flourishing. But I think for the Christian, it's a little bit different. I think for the Christian, it is a life centered on love of God and love of neighbor. And, I think we would say in that life, you do find ultimate fulfillment, satisfaction, freedom, meaning, purpose. But I think the means by which we receive those things is through Christ, through the person and work of Christ. And so I think that's where kind of biblical flourishing and what I would call false flourishing kind of go separate ways.
So we're talking about reaching the next generation and discipling the next generation. And when I look at what's going on right now, it feels like the generational transitions and the generational gaps are widening in rapid form, especially because of our access to pretty much everything on the internet, and the internet that sits in our pockets all day long. And so I also am real, and the more I see what's going on, I also see like there's this constant mixing of ideas and events and cultures that people are cherry picking or being influenced by to kind of define and chart their own way. They're building their own adventure. That doesn't always make it easy for spiritual formation, especially when you're embedded within a particular community at a particular time in a particular place, when people have sources all over the world that they're drawing from and influenced by. We're also somewhat from different generations. I mean, you and I are kind of like the Xennial generation, so we kind of border the Generation X and the Millennial. You're situated in the Millennial generation, but you're an unorthodox Millennial.
Yes.
And I'm not quite sure, Steve.
I'm a proud baby boomer. I'm there.
Yeah, so we're coming from a multiple generation and generational approach. And so I'm curious what you're seeing, especially when it comes to the next generation and how we disciple them. And what are some of the challenges and opportunities that we are facing today from your vantage point?
No, I'll start. I think 30 years ago when we started my church, I think one of the models is challenging a new generation to become committed followers of Jesus Christ. And the word there, the term there is the next generation. And the problem that we were trying to solve was, we're children of the immigrant church. But we realize that we're of a different generation. So how do we reach that generation? Does that mean that the services have to be in English, or do we all go into the Korean service and listen to interpretation, or go to Korean school and learn Korean? Can we have a band up in the stage, et cetera, right? And so we're thinking forward. How do you reach the next generation? At some point in time, I realized that our church was good at reaching my generation, but what about my kids' generation? My daughters, my older daughter's in her 30s now, et cetera. And so I've had to kind of rethink this, periodically. At some point in time, and you brought out this point, right, that we have the world in our pockets now. As baby boomers, our greatest spiritual influences are people older than us, or people who've written books, and books written normally by older people. And so we were mentored by the previous generation, generally speaking. At some point in time, as millennials, you started getting influenced by peers. And we saw that big shift, right, for the millennials. So they were less influenced by the older generation, more influenced by peers. And what I'm seeing now is the Gen Z or the younger people, they're now have gone beyond that even. They're not even influenced by peers, by anonymous echo chamber that they find themselves in. I think another thing that's going to happen next is I don't know what AI is going to do. So I don't know what the next generation even is going to be influenced by. And the question of how do we continue to disciple them, right? I think it still goes back to what Jesus did some 2,000 years ago, and it's incarnational ministry. That you just cannot replace incarnational ministry. Jesus came not as a tweet, not as an email, but he came in the form of a person and lived and died amongst them. And I think that's what the church still has to offer to every generation going forward. And we might feel outdated at times, but that's still that unique thing that we can give. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, on that note, I do think in a lot of ways, I think a time is coming, and it's probably here, when we really have to rethink, I think, the way that we've been doing church for a long time, because I don't necessarily think that that model is adequate to reach the next generation. I don't think there's anything insufficient about the message, but I do think, figuring out a way to, reach the new generation that is connected to a digital IV all week. We're still doing church with people gathered around a stage every Sunday, listening to content, and they have no shortage of content on their phones. And so I think that's a huge challenge. You're talking about a generation that, with the attention span, of a goldfish, you're talking to a generation that's busier. I'm speaking specifically about thinking about America and the Western church, maybe challenges of the Western church, busier than ever, more distracted than ever, more anxious than ever. And so I do think there are new challenges that leaders of the church right now are really going to have to start thinking about. Also, I would say a huge marked difference from the immigrant church in which I grew up in. I grew up in a time when missing church on a Sunday was like unheard of. Right. You couldn't, there was a cultural pull to go to church. Even if you didn't like it, you felt like you had to be there. I don't know that cultural pull still exists for Gen Z. That if they're not experiencing something compelling, or if they're not if they feel like they can find what the church offers somewhere else, I think they'll go somewhere else. Right. And so I do think it poses new challenges for pastors and leaders to have to think about and adapt to.
Yeah. Hey, Jason, so I want to ask you, you talked a little bit about how the younger generation, they are maybe not so used to hearing long monologues and the such. And I know that you're great, your church is so great with the younger generation. So how should the church evolve in terms of preaching the word of God or communicating? Should it be more collaborative? Should it be more small groups? Or does preaching really still matter?
To answer that question, yes, absolutely. I believe in the power of preaching God's word. And I don't know that it's an this or that, but more of a both and approach maybe. I think I grew up in a culture where all of the church's resources were galvanized to make that 1 hour event on Sunday happen. And I don't know that is going to fly anymore, And so I still believe in that. I just think churches need to actually start thinking also about what's happening Monday through Saturday. They should start thinking about how they're investing in their small groups. How are they creating more spaces for connection apart from Sundays? And I do think you probably know this better than anyone, but pastoring in many ways is also understanding human behavior. And I also do know that sometimes you can actually make things worse when you come in and just wipe the whole thing out and change everything. And so I do think, this is what a lot of our congregation members, especially those who grew up in the church, grew up with. This is familiar. There is a sense of I know what to expect when I come to church, that I think is, we don't have to get rid of everything, but I do think we need to start thinking beyond that, because I do think that overemphasis on the Sunday gathering was creating a very compartmentalized Christianity that I think is even more pronounced in Gen Z. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Michele.
Yeah, well, I feel like I have to come to terms with the fact that I'm no longer considered the youngest generation that people are trying to reach out to.
At this table.
As a millennial. But no, I just really see that one of the challenges for Gen Z and younger is, yeah, again, just this pulling of voices, right? So and I think we've already talked a little bit about this, about like the, there's influencers, there's content creators, podcasts. The culture now is if you have something to say, then it matters, which is great. But at the same time, it really just means that your voice as a pastor or as a youth leader is just now one amongst many that they are picking and choosing from. And it really is like a consumer culture, right? It is picking and choosing. I follow this person because I like what they produce. I love this TikTok because it makes me laugh, So those types of things where we just don't stand out, right? If we're going by the world's standards, that's something that we're contending against, right? And the hard thing is that we feel in our hearts, in our souls, that this is something that is a matter of eternity, right? So it's so important, but to be de-escalated so much in the perspective of young people, it's hard. So there's like this kind of misunderstanding of between generations, and it's not necessarily personal, right? It's not a personal thing against my pastor or whatever. It's really about, what do I have time for? What entertains me and brings me, flourishing in the world's mind? And really, it doesn't matter to me. And young people, they only really want to look more and learn more about the things that they care about, right? So if my church isn't going to speak out about, anti-Asian racism, but they care about it, or mental health, but they care about it, then I think then our voices go further down the food chain. So I think that's probably one of the key challenges that we face with reaching out to the next generation. There really needs to be this element of innovative ministry, meeting them where they're at. And I think you were mentioning this too, right? It's like it's a both and. Like, how do we keep the core of who we are as Christians, but also, meet them where they are.
So then, I mean, there's so many directions we can go with this, right? Especially because we're talking about how the church remains relevant to the next generation in light of another question that's asking, is the church relevant to the next generation? Which is undergirded by another question of, why are we even asking the question about relevance? Like, why do we even have to ask this question? Now, on the one hand, we can talk about what we need to do in order to reach and resonate with the next generation, or we can talk about why what we're doing isn't working, or we can talk about what the core functions of the church are. And I'm open to going in any of those directions if one of those appeals to us. This is a choose your own adventure.
And one thing I will say is that I think the quickest way for a church to not be relevant to the next generation is a church that tries so hard to be relevant. I do think the gospel and the Bible is relevant to every generation. And I think the church is maybe more relevant than ever if it was what I think Jesus wanted it to be. I think more than ever, when I talk to Gen Z, I see a hunger for stability in a world that is so chaotic to them. I see hunger for truth in a world where they're fed so much misinformation. They're kind of navigating different stories and lies. And actually the church at its best can offer that, and the gospel offers that. But I don't know that churches have really tapped into that, to be honest. And so, you could, you could play the game of the bells and whistles and try to be modern, but in 10 years, that is not modern anymore. That's outdated. So what does faithfully preaching and embodying the gospel look like, and in a way that is contextualized. Maybe that's a better word for it. Contextualized to the people who are entrusted to you.
How would you answer that question? Actually, so what should the church be, right? Because we're, one of the things. So in addition to the AACC, I lead something called the 10 by 10 collaboration, which is a youth discipleship movement that's seeking to reach 10 million young people over the next 10 years. And we're doing that through a collaborative manner. And we focus on Jesus and young people. For some reason, we're also finding that it's not, what we currently have is not working, right? Over 1 million young people are walking away from the faith every single year. They're not just leaving church, they're disaffiliating from Christianity. So what do we have now? I can paint a picture, and then what do we need? What should things be like? What's missing that we keep seeing what we're seeing?
You guys can take a stab at it.
Well, I feel like so many of the churches that I work with, a lot of their young people, they are given opportunities to serve in the church, but it's always like, can you stack the chairs or set up tables? Can you help serve food? Can you help do, help run the slides for Sunday morning? I have a lot of smaller churches, and there's something very, it's good that they're there, I guess. I think that's the approach, is that we have them in the building. But there's no authentic interaction in that. There's no them bringing what they have of themselves, their own gifts, their own talents to the community, and maybe some of them do enjoy setting up tables and chairs. I don't necessarily want to knock that, but being able to bring their voices into how are we leading our church, how are we speaking into our communities, decisions that are made by, your elder board, your deacon board, whatever. What's the age limit for your elder board? Can we have somebody who's 17 who really cares a lot about their faith, but has kind of different ideas than what the church is doing right now, So just having that authentic ministry that involves them as who they are, I think can go such a long way.
I remember I was talking to some of my elders about the book De-Churching, The Great De-Churching. Michael Graham and Jim Davis talked about the greatest movement of people out of the church in modern history now. And one of my elders made this remark that, is this really a bad thing? Or is it just becoming what it really is? Because was America really a church country, so a lot of people were affiliating with the church because there was a social advantage. And then leaving now, it's actually filtering the church and allowing it to become what it should become. The question that you pose is the church doing what it's supposed to be doing, and young people are leaving the church? Well, what if the goal wasn't trying to be the biggest, most populous, financially strong organization? What if that was not the goal? But rather the church being what it's supposed to be. It's a gathering of people who've responded to the Word of God, that they realize they're sinners in need of the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And they gather for that mission and that purpose and that change of life. And what results is a much smaller church footprint, but it is a true reflection of what Christ wants for the church. I made this remark one time. God the Father was a great parent, but Adam and Eve still left. And so was he a failure of a father? The young people leaving the church isn't always a reflection that the church isn't being what it's supposed to be. But perhaps, I think one of the things that we're trying so hard to be big and popular that we're abdicating the gospel essence sometimes. And when we do that, then we become more like the world, more relevant, more modern, more popular, etc. And then we start losing our distinctiveness. And then the young people say, why do I go there? Because I can find it here. So I don't know.
So here's what you're saying, right? So I hear you saying there's not meaningful opportunities to engage. I heard you saying that that the church is just trying to be big, and so in order to grow for the sake of growth, to be successful in the eyes of the world, younger people are disappearing from that. And then you're saying that a church that tries to be relevant is probably the most irrelevant church. Which, is that how you would describe the church today? A church that's trying to be too relevant, that's trying to be too big, and doesn't have meaningful places for young people to be engaged in.
One of the things that I said, I was teaching a class, is the Protestant church in America operates like a free market economy. And whatever sells, whatever gets bigger, whatever gathers the most amount of money and attention, that becomes the thing that everyone tries to emulate. And whatever tickles the ear, and Paul warns about that. And I think we continue to make that same mistake. And I'm not sure if that's what Christ wants for the church.
I mean, I agree. I mean, it's funny how we see the fruit of that over and over again, especially in the last few years with, scandal after scandal after scandal, and yet we can't seem to escape, I think our human inclination toward big, powerful, successful by worldly metrics. And so, and how those things are connected, I think, is, you're still seeing the church platform leaders who can draw a crowd,
right.
Leaders that can put butts in the seats,
right.
Can keep your church financially stable. And I think you're right. The church is losing its distinctiveness, and it's not, the relational organism that I think it was meant to be. And what I will say what I think about when I think about Gen Z, something that I hear regularly is like, they tell me everything they see that's bad right now in the world, like, and this is sad, but they just see more of that in the church. In fact, if they want to see like the culmination of that, they go to the church. They see the worst vitriol online coming from Christians, the most like abuses of power coming from Christians, and I don't know that the church right now is known for its love and its generosity and its radical compassion. And right there, I think you have a huge issue, because even when you talk about the early church, the church in Acts, the gospel was not diluted, it was straight up, but people saw a community of people who loved each other, shared all their possessions, and they had the favor of all people, and so how do we recover that in the church? I think that's a big question for Gen Z.
So this is, especially as Asian Americans, this is a pretty kind of difficult dynamic for us to navigate, right? Because on the one hand, if you look at most churches in the U.S., they're under 65 people. Economically, it's difficult. Y'all are in the Southern California area. If you don't have enough butts in the seats, if you're not big enough, you might have to go and work a second or third job in order to just be able to garner the time to be able to prepare your message, do the pastoral visits, to run an organization like a church. And then on the other hand, you might not be able to start an organization like Sola or something else that, and do other things if you're not big enough because you don't have the staff. Is there a point where a church can get too big? What is that? Is there a point where a church becomes too wealthy? What does that look like? Is it more a posture of just having, is it more a generous posture that we need to have? Like, what does that look like? I know of a Korean church in this area. They had a couple of very wealthy people, like national brands. They were a church of 200 to 300 people with a $10 million budget.
Yes.
They gave the majority, like 80 to 90% of that, away to missions. They decided never to buy a building. That person doesn't have that same money, and they're now stuck in a situation where they might be pushed out of this building that they've been worshiping in for decades, simply because they never invested. They invested in mission, but they never invested in a building, out of a heart to serve and out of a heart to be generous, and they don't have enough. Their size and their contributions aren't big enough to be able to support the ongoing ministry. What do you do? How do you navigate all this? I mean, there's so many dynamics at play. Is there a point where the church is too big? How do you know? Is there a church when if it's irrelevant? If your preaching is dry and boring, no one's going to come in, right? No one. If we live stream, right, that is a point of trying to get more people, get the message out to more people, get more people involved in the church. What are we supposed to do? So what should the church look like, maybe, is a better question.
You know, I want to maybe make sure that we understand that just because the church is big, it doesn't mean it's bad. The early church in Acts 2, it was a mega church right off the beginning, and they didn't even have amplified sound, right? They didn't have a building or anything, but they gathered 3,000 and more people. And then they went house to house, kind of like what you were saying, big and then small, etc. I don't know if there's a magical number, say this is too big or this is too small or it can't sustain itself. The churches in China are now showing us an example of how you can thrive without the big churches and in homes, the house church movement, et cetera. I don't know if there's just a one size fit all type of an approach, but I do think that one of the ways at which Asian American churches, that we can contribute at least, is this, that we've learned how to be minorities in this country. And our parents, the immigrant church, learned how to gather, and that relationally, that was so important, breaking bread together and being aunts and uncles to each other's families. That became integral to the part of the church. So the church wasn't a place where our parents went just to hear the best messages or get the best music. It was a church to do community. And I think that's what we can maybe bring to the table. The importance of that relationship, that, what did you call it? Relational whatever.
Organism.
Yeah, organism. That's the thing that we can bring to the table and say, hey, this must be a part of the church.
Yeah, I feel like ultimately, I don't think it matters, again, how big a church is or what it looks like if they have their own building. If that church that you're talking about, if that was their calling, like if God was like, in this time, I want you to give that 80% to missions, then what they did was faithful. And I don't think that was an unwise investment if that's what they felt like God was prompting them to do with those gifts, right? And a part of what we experience, as Christians, as faithful believers, we take those leaps of faith to say, okay, we don't have a church building though, God, you know this, but God knows our needs, and we'll provide what we need, right, for whatever season we're in. So ultimately, maybe God has a purpose for that really big church, that will be able to speak into like public matters, that the community can like look to for as kind of like a beacon to speak out. Maybe there's whatever purpose it is that God would have for each community. Ultimately, it just boils down to, are you being faithful? Are you following what God is prompting you and calling you to do? I think the fruit is what really is the determining factor of how a church would flourish, right? If it is flourishing.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think there probably is an obsession with keeping the church doors open. Like when I talk about the church, I mean like the institution or like your local church, or keeping the lights on. Like that's the goal, to make sure we're still in business. When I do think actually the goal should be, like what type of people are we becoming? Have we become? Are we people dependent on the Holy Spirit? Is Christ at the forefront of everything that we do? And are we faithful to the task that we feel like God has given us. And I think if you can say yes to those things, I'm sure like there are churches I know that are still meeting. I mean, I don't know if I can say this. They should have died a long time ago, and so I obviously I think as with everything, I think there's wisdom, and there are probably ways that we can do things that are more effective than other ways. But at the end of the day, I think the only, it's interesting, right? That at the end of life, God doesn't say that He's going to say, well done, good and successful servant, or, servant who's been around the longest. It's good, well done, good and faithful servant. That there is just a faithfulness element to, this is what we're called to, this is who we're going to be, and this is the type of community we want to cultivate here.
But Ray, if the question that we're discussing is how do we disciple the next generation, right? I think churches can have seasons. And God can take the lampstand away from a church and close its door. But that doesn't mean that they weren't not used by God in their season, right? So if this Korean church faithfully were obedient to what they thought, perhaps they helped build buildings in Brazil and Ecuador or elsewhere, and at the sacrifice of not owning a building. And so let's say this particular church is one of the churches that has to close its door. I would say, well done still, right? But if the question was, how do we build into the next generation? How do we disciple the next generation? One of the other questions that we should ask is, who is the next generation? And I think this is what you care about a lot, is America is becoming more and more diverse, right? Are there really, like in the LA area, in the downtown LA area, are there actually too few church buildings? Probably to accommodate all the organic churches. Probably the answer is no. There's probably sufficient because of the historic churches that were in LA. But are they helping the next generation to fulfill their calling? And probably the answer is no, because they're holding on to their building and not passing it on, or not looking at the next generation, which is more ethnically diverse, are able to reach the emerging generation. But the older generation, the older churches are just holding on, saying, hey, we care about our legacy and not the next generation. And so...
Yeah, that's good. I mean, so this generation, especially those that are 20 and under, is the first generation where the majority is made of minorities.
Right.
Right? And so the first time in U.S. history where, there's the population is mostly made up, especially those 20 and under, of racialized minorities. But your question is good, and I think I want to drill down into this, and this is how we can end. I think we continue to name that churches need to be faithful, that church leaders need to pursue God's will, and we need to do that contextually. But for this time and place, what does that look like? So are the churches that currently exist, whether they are shrinking, staying in terms of numbers, shrinking, stagnant, or growing, are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? Or should they continue to just do what they have always done? What does a faithful church look like? Right? What is a church that's not pursuing relevance, that's not just trying to grow, that's making meaningful space for young people? What does that actually look like?
Yeah, I think, piggybacking off of one thing that Michele said, is that, hey, when do you give a younger person opportunities to lead? Should a 19-year-old be an elder or something like that, right? I think it was something like Andy Stanley said, like, the older generation can't dictate to the younger generation, the next generation, how it's supposed to do church, because we don't know. Only they know. And but oftentimes, by the time that they are able to lead, they don't have the resources, et cetera. So that what a church should do is empower the next generation, to give them the platform, the influence that they need to answer that question for that generation.
Does it mean that they are speaking at the pulpit once a month?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It means hiring strategically. It means sharing leadership. It means platforming them even though they're not ready. It means allowing them to help make decisions, although sometimes it doesn't seem to make sense. One of the things that
that was a loaded statement.
Yeah.
Even though it seems-
It's a learning process.
yeah, but one of the things that, like, as we grew up in the immigrant church, we say, "Oh, I wish they would share power or something like that." But now that we have power, we don't want to share power because we want what's relevant for our generation. But I think what we need to do is, like, when we become the older men, older women in the church, how do we empower the younger men and the younger women to lead and to transform the church into the kind of church that it needs to be to reach the children's generation now? And it probably isn't what we want. But I think that's a simple answer for me.
So how are you doing that? I mean, we've been talking,
Yeah.
about, because I think at this point it'd be really helpful to have a tangible example, because there are a lot. I would say that the majority of churches in the U.S. right now are aging. I think that the average age of the church in the U.S., their senior pastors, is around 55. And there's a lot of denominations that I'm hearing where the average age of the pastor is about 65. And there's one denomination I know that over 50% of all their pastors are over the age of 65.
Wow.
Maybe you can kind of share based on, because you've been in ministry for 30 years.
I think, I don't know about Michele's ministry context in terms of church context, but I know Jason, right? So Jason's church, the profile of Jason's church is like the dream scenario for a lot of denominations. It's like, oh, Asian Americans, like a lot of Gen Zs, in their 20s and 30s. We would love that for their church. I was having a conversation with a denominational leader, and he was saying, yeah, they're quoting all these statistics, et cetera. And part of me is like, your denomination just gave one of your buildings to another white church planter. And I was so upset. What they could have done is looked at the future, looked at the city that the city is becoming, and say, if we're going to do this, we should rebirth this, gift this, partner with a younger, diverse, or an Asian American congregation to do this. A church like Citizens, hey, would you want to partner with us? Join our denomination, and we can help you become the future of our denomination. Our church, we're old, and so we empowered younger people already. But I think for the average denominational leader, institutional leaders, those that have the resources and authority and the power and influence, I hope that they would do that. Yeah.
Literally hand over the keys and the deed.
Yeah.
They will take
I wouldn't
it.
complain. We'll take it.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, Jason and I have talked a little bit about that. I think that's what they should do. Yeah.
But maybe not with the caveat that they need to join the denomination. But maybe it's just a gift, a kingdom gift.
Well, they can't. Well, denominational churches can't just do that. Sure. But they can. Yeah.
How about y'all? What should the church be, especially to effectively reach and disciple the next generation? What does it mean to be faithful?
Gosh, I have a lot of thoughts swimming around in my head. But maybe what I can offer is kind of just sharing from my own experience as, I think I've seen a lot of our Asian American churches, and then granted, I have mostly had experience within our American Baptist context, but, different Asian American churches within the Fresno area, which is where I'm from.
And you worked with InterVarsity?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
so you
campus
worked
ministry
with,
too, yes.
So college students for a long time?
Yeah. And I feel like, again, there's like this iteration of kind of like churches saying, look, we really need to reach our young people. We want to empower them. So let's create a ministry or a project for them that they can lead. And as well-meaning as that can be, that's still trying to present a shoebox and saying, here, get into the shoebox and do what you want to do, you know? But I think what young people really need in order to thrive and to be set up for success for the future years is not limiting them with the shoebox, you know? Giving them something, a space to say, what is your passion? What is your dream of what God can do in our context? And let's not hold anything back, you know? Like, obviously, yes, realities are, what's the money, all those things, right? But you know, like, it's a journey, right? You're talking about, you know, maybe some of the ideas that they start off might not be as strong or feasible, but once you dream up of something, we can work backwards and say, okay, let's take a look at what we have, what are our resources, let's journey that together. And I think that, as we pursue faithfully together, is such a beautiful way forward that is a true partnership, not just here's our idea, now you can run with it, you know. I've seen that a number of times, and I just really sense that, you know, young people, they're just like, okay, but this isn't really something that I'm passionate about, or I don't really resonate with this, or maybe I would do it differently. So how can we enable their innovative way of engaging kingdom work? Right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question was,
What does it mean to be? What does it look like? What do we need to do to actually be faithful? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, we've been thinking about that a lot at our church as well. Like, at the end of each year, what does success look like for us? You know, that we've been faithfully, you know, leading and serving in the way that we feel God has called us to. And the way that we have, that what has helped us is we kind of have it, we basically say that a person who comes through our community, that at the end of each year, our kind of measure of faithfulness will be like asking the question, how are they doing in 4 core relationships? You know, their relationship with God, relationship with self, relationship with others, and by others we mean kind of like their core relationships, and relationship with the world. You know, how they you know, view the work that, you know, how they view their place in the city and in the world, and how are you doing in those core relationships? So less about how many people do we have in this ministry, you know, has the giving increased, more about asking all of our leaders and everyone who is a part of this community, how are you doing in those 4 core areas? And using that kind of as a frame to mentor, you know, older mentoring the younger generation. I think that has helped us in many ways, because we're starting to realize when you use that frame, there are a lot of gaps. And you realize there are a lot of gaps in the ways that we've been discipled. Thus, it helps us to identify the gaps in the way that we're mentoring and raising up the next generation. So one very practical example to that is relationship with self. One of the things we realized very quickly when that became kind of a metric was that in an Asian American church, and when we're talking about discipling the next generation, not just the next generation in general, but of Asian American Christians, we realized so many of the leaders do not know themselves. They are completely disconnected from their identity. You know, they are the identity that was given to them by dominant culture, or the identity that they adopted to fit in with the mold. And so they now have no sense of self that they can then pass on to the next generation. And it's this cycle that keeps going on. So I think finding a metric that helps us to see, like, oh, okay, like I got to figure out who I am, you know, because I really hate myself. Our relationship with others, you know, they're realizing like, oh man, I have this very strained relationship with my parents that's rooted in like trauma or rooted in some like my experiences growing up in an immigrant family that I had never really processed. And I'm taking a lot of that and I'm passing that on to the next generation. And so how do you first create a discipleship process for your people that's contextualized, and in our context that would be to Asian Americans, that can help them grow in these core areas so that they can then take that and then pass it on to the next generation and the generation
You know,
after
I
that.
think this is a great example of how, at my generation, we would never even think about what my relationship with myself is. We would think, why would we do that? And if we created a frame for the younger generation, okay, we want you to think about discipleship in this box and not include that, you know, that would not be effective. But it's, okay, if we empower this next, okay, what does discipleship look like? You create this quadrant or so. That's something that we would not have thought of. That's what's kind of resonating with the people at Citizens. And when I hear you, I go, oh, okay, boy, the young people or the people at my church, I need to think about that. Well, thank you so much. That's brilliant.
Yeah, that's good.
And just to affirm what you're doing, Asian Americans of all the major racial groups, we have the least understanding of our own history and the least understanding of our own kind of upbringing or our own kind of personal narratives.
Right.
And so there's a study that's coming out that kind of reveals that, and it explains so much. Right? I mean, there is this self-distancing and undervaluing of, and a lot of it just comes from a lack of knowledge and a lack of knowing how to categorize ourselves within the broader world. This is so good. Like all these conversations, I wish that we can just keep going, but we don't have infinite time. In heaven, we will be able to. In the new heavens and the new earth, we'll be able to talk about this all the time. And in our Asian American redeemed bodies. And so thanks for joining me at the table. This was a conversation that if you find helpful, we encourage you to share with others. If you haven't checked out the resources, the other resources at the Asian American Christian Collaborative, please do so. Go online at AA Christ Collab or AsianAmericanChristianCollaborative.com. Check us out on social media at AA Christ Collab. We are a volunteer-driven and a donor-funded organization. So if you are so inclined and the Spirit is leading you, please go online and contribute and support us. We'd be so blessed that we can continue to do this type of work. But until next time, we'll see you next time. Thank you.